Okay, so welcome everybody to this presentation and discussion on Fratelli Tutti, right? On fraternity and social friendship, Pope Francis's third encyclical. Tonight we'll just be talking about the first two chapters, but I loved his little quote that I have right here. You can see it in the sixth paragraph, right? What he has sought to do is make this reflection an invitation to dialogue among people, all people of goodwill. So that's what I want to happen tonight, really, is a discussion based on the insights and the wisdom that Pope Francis puts forward in the first couple chapters. So in his introduction, which he titles Without Borders, he brings in St. Francis, right? That's where the title of this comes from, is a quote from St. Francis. And what Pope Francis is doing, in imitation of St. Francis, he wants to call for a love that transcends the barriers of geography and distance, right? Because even though we're more connected now than we've ever been, we're kind of falling into our own little camps and isolated echo chambers. So he's calling us out of those echo chambers in order to transcend the barriers of geography and distance. And he said, St. Francis, he didn't wage war with words aimed at imposing doctrines, but he simply spread the love of God. And in order to spread the love of God, it takes action, it takes being in the world, it takes being out there and loving people personally, you know? So he says right up front, right? The following pages don't claim to offer complete teaching on fraternal love, but rather to consider its universal scope, its openness to every man and woman. And you got to really keep that in mind while you're reading this. It's a giant encyclical. It's even bigger than his last one. And that's partially because he's trying to consider it in a universal scope. Now, one of the things Aristotle says is when you're talking about universals as opposed to particulars, they're really big ideas. They're not super precise. And that's what's going on here with a lot of what Pope Francis is talking about. He's like, we got to think outside the box. We got to think big picture. We got to think outside borders in order to move forward into the next century, really. Okay, so the first chapter is giant. It's the biggest of all the 8 chapters in his entire encyclical. And it's really kind of a downer because it's all about dark clouds over a closed world. So it's basically talking about all the bad things that are piling up because of different situations and different technologies and different ways people are approaching politics and things. So that's what this first part is about, right? And it's split into these little sections that I have here, right? So let's move on. The first part, he talks about shattered dreams. Okay. Going forward, everything in this blue box, everything in the blue box over here is Pope Francis's quotations. So everything in the blue box is always directly Pope Francis. Anything above my head, these are just my thoughts or somebody else's thoughts or something like that, okay? So that's how I help us keep that distinction between what Pope Francis actually said and just my random thoughts, okay? So at the beginning, his shattered dreams part, each new generation must take up the struggles and attainments of past generations while setting its sights even higher. And he's criticizing this end of historical consciousness, right? There's a growing loss of a sense of history, breakup, a kind of deconstructionism. And he's like, what does certain words even mean these days? Everybody talks about democracy, freedom, justice, unity, but what do they really mean? People just use these words kind of as catchphrases. And so what he's saying is, I think, harkens back a little bit to what Aristotle said in his Nicomachean Ethics, where every generation needs to grow and build on the attainments and struggles of past generations, right? So we have to recognize those struggles, those attainments, and we have to be brought up in the good habits of previous generations, the wisdom of our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. We have to pass those on in order for us to be able to understand political science in a sense. Okay, so the next little section in chapter 1 is talking about how we lack a plan for everyone and how right now we're so isolated. We need to break out into a bigger plan, because when we don't have a plan for everyone, we can end up thinking about like a throwaway world, right? We end up depriving young people of a connection to their roots and a wisdom. Um, Insufficiently universal human rights. There's forms of enslavement that are still a major problem that we need to take seriously as a whole human race, all of us together. And there's a lot of conflict and fear. We have certain ancestral fears that technology and technological development, they'll never be able to get rid of, because every single person has to deal with those existential questions every generation that needs to come up. Now, so many of our communication devices isolate us into our own peer groups. I don't know if any of you have seen a movie on Netflix called The Social Dilemma, but it talks about how many of these social networks have been built in order to maintain our attention so that they can sell that attention to advertisers. And that, as a byproduct, gets us kind of stuck in echo chambers. Like, they see what you click on, they see you like this particular politician, they start sending you more and more stuff about that politician and stuff against the other guy, and then you just kind of go off this cliff in a sense. And this prevents us from creating a plan for everyone, I think. Okay, next. Globalization and progress without a shared roadmap. He said this isolation, withdrawal, it never is the way to restore hope and bring about renewal. Rather, what we need is a closeness, a culture of encounter. Isolation, no. Closeness, yes. Culture clash, no. Culture of encounter, yes. Don't isolate yourself with like-minded thinkers. So many of people I know on Facebook, right? I try to maintain as many friendships as I can from all walks of life, because I like hearing different points of views. If you ever, I would really strongly recommend never unfriending someone just because they don't agree with your views, right? Because if you cut off people because they disagree with you, then you're just getting stuck in an echo chamber. You have to have conversations with people from all perspectives. That's what Pope Francis is calling us to. Now, it's difficult. It's extremely difficult, especially with COVID isolating us more through technology and stuff. It's compounding this difficulty, which is partially why I think this encyclical is just timed providentially perfectly, because we need to hear this now more than ever. But you can't isolate yourself with like-minded thinkers. Another really kind of neat thing I've discovered recently is a website called Ground News, and it gathers all the news stories from every single news source, the same exact story, and presents them side by side so you can see how the same story is presented by different news outlets. It's pretty neat as well. Okay. Pope Francis also talks a little about pandemics and other calamities in history. This quote here is pretty powerful. We feed ourselves on dreams of splendor and grandeur and end up consuming distraction, insularity, and solitude. We gorged ourselves on networking and lost the taste of fraternity. We looked for quick and safe results, only to find ourselves overwhelmed by impatience and anxiety. Prisoners of a virtual reality, we lost the taste and flavor of the truly real. That's painful to read because it's so true. And we must strive to connect to the real. It's so important. You got to spend time in nature. You got to grow a garden. Like, my dad was a farmer, my brother's a farmer. I grew up on a farm, and there's just so much beauty to be found in nature and the cycle of nature. But we also have to spend time in front of the truly real, Jesus Christ, in the Eucharist, in adoration. I remember talking to a few of the different Newman Center ministers we have as Dominicans. We run quite a few Newman Centers in the Western Province. And they say one of the things that young people are really attracted to these days is adoration of the real presence, because it's not a screen, it's not connected to anything like that. Just go and sit in front of God, Creator, Jesus Christ, salvation of the world. It's beautiful. You grow in holiness, you grow in sanctity by spending time in front of the truly real, the Eucharist, right? Okay. The next part Pope Francis talks about is an absence of human dignity on the borders. Now, this shocked me a little bit, actually, the way Pope Francis discussed this issue, because it's different from what I normally hear. Um, we have some missionaries down in Central America as a Dominican province, and I've heard some of them mention things along these lines, thinking similar to how Pope Francis speaks as his encyclical here. But he first thing he says, sadly, some are attracted by Western culture, sometimes with unrealistic expectations that expose them to grave disappointments. And so, for this reason, there is also a need to reaffirm the right not to immigrate, that is, to remain in one's homeland, to make it better where you're at. Now, I was not expecting Pope Francis to say something like that, especially with everything going on in our borders here in the United States. But there's some wisdom in that, because, like, the missionaries we have in Central America are saying, when you have these illusions that are fostered by so much of our media and Hollywood, and you get this grass is greener on the other side mentality, and you just want to be there, but are unrealistic expectations. He said if people would focus more on building up where they're at, it gives you more faith in your homeland. I don't know. It really shocked me. This section really kind of surprised me. And then another quote. Yeah, it is also true that an individual and a people are only fruitful and productive if they are able to develop a creative openness to others. And that's true in my own personal experience. That's what this little thought bubble's about, right? The most loving, healthy, and holy families I've experienced are the ones that are most radically open to, that are the most radically open families who, when I go visit, I just immediately feel embraced, like I am just another member of the family. It's stunning when you experience something that beautiful. And it just rings just so much truth in this little quote here from Pope Francis, um, because you have this radical openness that just embraces everybody to become part of your family. Um, it's a beautiful thing. Okay, now the next part he talks about is the illusion of communication, and how digital connectivity is not enough to build bridges. It's not capable of uniting humanity. Just straight up says that, full stop. All our social networking, all our ways of connecting, thousands of friends on Facebook, he says it's not capable of uniting humanity because of, for instance, shameless aggression. Social aggression has found unparalleled room for expansion through computers and mobile devices. And it's also information without wisdom. True wisdom demands an encounter with reality. Um, right? That made me think of Proverbs, the definition of wisdom in the Bible. The beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Information, data, even if we have the most brilliant algorithms to analyze all the data, it's not going to give us wisdom. Wisdom is a human trait, and it's built on this reverence for God, this love of God, where we see and work and cooperate with God and providence in building a human family together. So, information without wisdom, you just end up having these hollow debates, in a sense, because it's just data versus data. And then everybody is picking their own facts. And then you have this fact versus this fact, and people just cherry pick their own facts to build up their own little world, in a sense. And you don't get wisdom. Wisdom needs to be built on unity and on God and on sanctity. Okay. The next part, Pope Francis talks about forms of subjection and self-contempt, right? A shallow and pathetic desire to imitate others leads to copying and consuming in place of creating, and fosters low national self-esteem. And destroying self-esteem is an easy way to dominate others. This is kind of a dig at, I guess, countries like us, where we kind of project how we're a first world country as opposed to a third world country, right? Just that terminology in itself kind of destroys the self-esteem of the culture of those third world countries who have, I mean, every country's been around. They have history, we have our culture. Um, and just that type of terminology destroys the self-esteem of others, which allows us to dominate them and impose our worldview on them in a way that is not legitimate, right? This quote from Romans, I love, right? Let love be sincere, hate what is evil, hold on to what is good. It's so important not to just throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Everybody has a history. We're fallen humanity. We've fallen, we've made mistakes. And you have to hate what is evil and reject it, learn from that failure. But then you got to cling to what is good. You have to sift through and find the good and the true and the beautiful in the history of your nature, of your culture, right? And every culture needs to do that. Okay. Hope. Yay, we got through all the bad stuff. Finally. Okay, so he ends chapter 1 with this short little section called Hope. And he says, despite these dark clouds, which may not be ignored, I would like in the following pages to take up and discuss many new paths of hope. Oh, yes. And the Catechism says hope is the confident expectation of divine blessing and the beatific vision of God. Beautiful. Okay, so chapter 2 is not nearly as long as chapter 1. Chapter 1 was huge, 22 pages. Chapter 2 is like 8 pages, I think. So it's a lot shorter. And the whole thing is framed within the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? Wish to devote a chapter to a parable told by Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago. And the context is the good parable. Love does not care if a brother or sister is in need comes from one place or another, for love shatters the chains that keep us isolated and separate. In their place, it builds bridges, right? Love unites. And the more perfect the love, the more perfect the union. God's love, God is perfect love. That's how the Trinity is one God, because the perfect love of the Trinity is perfectly one. It's beautiful. And then he talks about being abandoned by the wayside. Now, he also gave him something, talking about the Good Samaritan, right? The Good Samaritan also gave him something that in our frenetic world we cling to tightly. He gave him his time. Time is such a valuable gift. In today's world, especially. I remember when I first moved out to Washington, D.C. to go to grad school, I had nothing, right? Just moved out there had nothing. And I, for the first time, was really experiencing homeless people on the street, and it was tearing up my heart. And there was this priest out there who gave me the best advice. It's incredible. I remember it now, even 15 years later. He said, the most important thing to do whenever you see a homeless person on the street is to treat them like a person. Say hello, ask their name, ask them to pray for you, say you'll pray for them. Give them an authentic encounter with somebody who treats them like a real person. And I just love that. And I've tried to live in that, with that advice on my heart whenever I see somebody, because it's something we cling to tightly, but giving your time is a great gift in today's world. Okay, a story constantly retold. Now, these two little quotes from Pope Francis here, I think, are excellent because they're very practical. Like, here's how we can judge how we're doing in this process. First, the decision to include or exclude those lying wounded along the roadside can serve as a criterion for judging every economic, political, social, and religious project, right? Are you including those people who are wounded or not? Okay. And he says there are only two kinds of people: those who care for someone who's hurting and those who pass by, those who bend down to help or those who look the other way. Here, all our distinctions, labels, and masks fall away. It is the moment of truth. It's so true, right? Gospel of Matthew, by their fruits you will know them. This is what it comes down to. Do you pass by in the moment, or do you stop and help? The characters of the story, okay, the guarantee of an authentic openness to God on the one hand, is a way of practicing our faith that helps open our hearts to our brothers and sisters. And he says, paradoxically, those who claim to be unbelievers can sometimes put God's will into practice better than believers. This is true. I mean, you can see it in the Bible, in the Old Testament, right? King Cyrus wasn't Jewish. He wasn't a follower of God or anything. But King Cyrus followed the will of God in issuing the proclamation, right? So unbelievers can follow the will of God better than believers. And it's painful, but it's true. We need to grow closer to God. All of us, every single human being needs to. Anyway, okay, I'm going kind of longer than 15 minutes. So let me kind of wrap up here. So starting anew, he says we should not expect everything from those who govern us, for that would be childish. I think that's a great thing for us to hear as everybody's losing their minds over the current presidential election, right? We have the space we need for co-responsibility in creating and putting into place new processes and changes. And we can start from below and case by case act at the most concrete and local levels, and then expand to the furthest reaches of our countries and of our world, right? Neighbors without borders. Now, and he flips this Good Samaritan idea of neighbor in a really cool way here. Because Jesus doesn't ask us not to decide who is close enough to be our neighbor, but rather that we ourselves become neighbors to all, right? So it's not that who is our neighbor, everybody is our neighbor. No, we are the neighbors to everybody else. You see that subtle distinction there? I think that's brilliant. Pope Francis does that here. I should no longer say that I have neighbors to help, but that I must myself be a neighbor to others. Our call to love, one that transcends all prejudices, all history and cultural barriers, all petty interests. And then he concludes here with the plea of the stranger. For this reason, it's important that catechesis and preaching speak more directly and clearly about these four things: about the social meaning of existence, about the fraternal dimension of spirituality, about our conviction of the inalienable dignity of each person, and about our reasons for loving and accepting all our brothers and sisters.